The Election of Harold Washington by Mandy Bryan. Harold Washington is well known as the very first African American mayor of Chicago.
You've done so much, I'm going to give you all I've got, everything I've got. I wouldn't give it to anybody else. I saved it for you because I want you to have it. Every one of you. You know what it is? I'm going to be your mayor for the next 20 years.
Although some Chicagoans were not ready for an African American mayor, the election of Harold Washington was a significant turning point because it led to more diversity, providing more opportunities for African Americans, Latinos, women, and paved the way for many more great leaders. Washington was in office from the years of 1983 to 1987. During Washington's election, Chicago was facing a lot of important decisions. However, some Democrats did not support Washington because they were not ready for an African American to lead Chicago. In the years of 1983 to 1987, life was quite interesting. Chicago was learning to become more diverse, even though there was still some racism. Segregation was abolished when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed and signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Chicago had to face a big transition with diversity in government, neighborhoods, education, and even the workforce. However, there was still some racial tension. Black community leaders, white liberal wards, and of course, citizens of Chicago were involved in the election of Harold Washington. Black, Latino, and white voters influenced the turning point of the election of Harold Washington. The election of Harold Washington was a turning point because it became an anchorage for a more diverse and equal society in Chicago. Harold Washington made several changes in Chicago's government. These changes included the termination of the political machine. In addition, he lengthened contracts for African Americans, Hispanics, and women because not only were blacks exercising their freedom, but females were also. The impacts of these changes brought Chicago closer to their mayor and called for a more integrated society instead of just a white Chicago or a black Chicago. The election of Harold Washington affected local African American communities, local welfare organizations, and black preachers because black churches wanted to support this historical movement of Chicago's very first African American mayor. It even affected white Americans because they had to adapt to a more integrated society.
Chicago, Chicago, that's our the town. Chicago.
The machine that ran Chicago doesn't work anymore. Yet Jane Byrne and Richie Daley are still fighting over it. Harold Washington has a different plan.
But while they fight over that machine, I shall fight for Chicago by getting jobs and money from the state and federal government.
Harold Washington.
We can all win.
The effects of the election of Harold Washington were both positive and negative. The election inspired African Americans to have their very first black mayor, but there were some racial conflicts with Washington. This included a split in the white vote. Washington's victory against a well-known white Republican had set his opponent, Mayor Jane Byrne, and the son of Mayor M. Daley.
Mr. Washington paved the way for Chicago, the land of opportunity for all white, black, Latino men, women, and children. Studies have shown that Chicago was the most segregated city. But Washington changed that with more diversity in jobs and got rid of the political firing or hiring. But to such great shocking and astounding news, Chicago received the news that Mayor Harold Washington died.
Harold Washington died from a heart attack after winning his second term of office on November 25, 1987. His death was a great loss throughout all communities. There were many people that came and supported the funeral of Mr. Washington. Even though Harold Washington passed away, his legacy lives on, even in the famous Harold Washington Library founded in downtown Chicago. This library is where many talented people will work and study the very different artifacts or books studied in the library. And this is where so many leaders can be formed, for example, like the very first African American president, Barack Obama.
Extraordinary honor to receive the Harold Washington Award. Some of you may know that I originally moved to Chicago in part because of the inspiration of Mayor Washington's campaign. And he was there in Chicago when I moved there more than 2 decades ago. And for those of you who recall that era and recall Chicago at that time, it's hard to forget the sense of possibility that he sparked in people.
Washington had an effect on our society because Chicago is more diverse than it's ever been. We now live in a country with the very first African American president, Barack Obama. Washington set the bar for African Americans, and we live in a society where we see the results of not only a more integrated Chicago, but a more integrated nation.